Welcome to our channel, your gateway to the most spine-chilling tales and unnerving true stories. Today, we present a harrowing true story. Whispers in the halls of Westbrook High School. As the pale moonlight streamed through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor, Amelia's heart raced with a mixture of fear and determination. She was no stranger to the strange occurrences that had been plaguing Westbrook High School in recent weeks. The eerie whispers in the hallways, the flickering lights, and the feeling of being watched had become all too familiar. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had to confront the source of it all. With a deep breath, she gathered her courage and stepped out into the dimly lit school hallway. The air was cold and still, carrying with it an unsettling silence that seemed to press against her ears. The familiar posters and bulletin boards, once a source of comfort and familiarity, now seemed to loom menacingly in the shadows. The school's janitor, Mrs. Jenkins, was nowhere to be seen, and Amelia couldn't help but feel a pang of worrying for the elderly woman. Her steps slow and measured, Amelia made her way down the hallway toward the gym teacher's office. The office door was ajar, and she could hear muffled voices coming from within. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling on the doorknob. She knew that whatever she was about to find, it wouldn't be good. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the only source of illumination coming from a single flickering lamp on the teacher's desk. At first glance, it seemed to be empty, but as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadowy figure darted past the window, disappearing into the hallway. Startled, she took a step forward, only to stop dead in her tracks when she heard a low, menacing growl emanating from the shadows. Fear gripped her like an icy vice, and she couldn't help but tremble. Whatever it was that lurked in the darkness, it wasn't human. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that she was no longer alone. The figure in the hallway seemed to be moving closer, and with each step, the growling grew louder. Panic threatened to overwhelm her senses, but she fought to remain calm. She knew that she had to confront whatever it was, or risk losing control of the situation. Taking a deep breath, Amelia stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The figure froze, its outline silhouetted against the moonlit window. It was a werewolf. Its eyes glowed an unnatural shade of yellow, and its fangs gleamed in the dim light. For a moment, they locked gazes, and Amelia felt a primal fear she'd never experienced before. But then, the werewolf's lips curled back in a snarl, revealing jagged, bloodstained fangs. With a snarl of its own, Amelia summoned her courage and charged forward. She threw herself at the creature, aiming for its throat. Her fingers brushed against its fur, and she felt the strength of the creature as it easily dodged her attack. It lunged back, its claws slashing through the air mere inches from her face. They circled each other, both fighting for the upper hand. Amelia knew that she couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even for a moment. The hallway seemed to spin around her as they fought, their breaths hot against each other's skin. Amelia ducked under a swinging claw and delivered a sharp kick to the werewolf's side. It howled in pain, and she took the opportunity to grab its arm. With all her might, she wrenched it behind its back, forcing the creature to the ground. It struggled violently beneath her, but she held fast. She knew that she had to end this now. Her grip tightening on the werewolf's arm, Amelia felt a surge of power flow through her. A bright light filled her vision, and with a single thrust of her hand, a beam of pure energy shot forth from her palm. It struck the werewolf square in the chest, and with a final howl of agony, it dissolved into a pile of dust and fading shadow. The hallway fell silent once more, and Amelia slumped to the ground, exhausted and terrified. As the dust settled, Amelia took a shaky breath and looked around. The eerie whispers had ceased, and the flickering lights had returned to normal. Whatever had been causing the strange occurrences at Westbrook High School, it was finally over. She didn't know how she'd managed to defeat the werewolf, or why it had been there in the first place, but she was just glad that it was gone. Slowly, she rose to her feet and made her way back to her classroom, her heart still racing with fear and disbelief. From that day forward, Amelia never again questioned the strange occurrences that had plagued Westbrook High School. She knew that there were things in this world that went bump in the night, and that sometimes, it fell to her to keep them at bay. And while the memories of that fateful night would haunt her for the rest of her days, she took comfort in knowing that she had faced her fears and emerged victorious. For she was no ordinary student. She was the defender and the protector of her school, And as long as she had breath in her lungs, no monster, no matter how ferocious or powerful, would ever harm another student again. Amelia's heart hammered in her chest as she raced toward the source of the scream. Around her, the school seemed to buzz with malevolent energy. Every shadow, every creak in the floorboards, sent a shiver of dread down her spine. As she turned a corner, she came face to face with a terrified classmate cowering against the wall. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, and her lips moved soundlessly. Amelia tried to calm her down, but the girl seemed beyond reason. Then, from the darkness, a voice hissed, "Come to me, Amelia. You belong with us." Shaking off the unsettling feeling that the voice had been directed at her, Amelia focused on the frightened girl. "Hey, it's okay," she said softly. "What's going on? Can you tell me what you saw?" The girl's eyes darted around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I don't know," she stammered. "There was just something. It felt like it was watching me." Amelia put a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. "Look, I know this is scary, but we're going to get through this together. Why don't you tell me your name and we can figure out what's going on?" The girl seemed to gather some courage, her trembling subsiding slightly. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice barely audible. "And I think there's something in this school. Something bad." The words sent a chill down Amelia's spine, and she glanced nervously around the hallway. "Okay, Sarah," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Why don't you go back to class, and we'll figure out what to do. I'm going to go find a teacher or the principal, okay?" Sarah nodded, still looking frightened. But at least she seemed to trust Amelia's plan. With one last reassuring pat on Sarah's shoulder, Amelia turned and continued down the hallway, her steps now hesitant. As she rounded another corner, she heard a strange creaking noise coming from the ceiling above her. Looking up, she saw a flicker of movement in the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized that whatever was in the school was now following her. Terror gripped her as she raced toward the gym teacher's office, the dark figure moving with inhuman speed just out of her line of sight. She burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her, and collapsed against the wall, panting for air. The gym teacher looked up from her desk, alarmed. "Amelia, what's wrong? You look terrified," she exclaimed. Tears streaming down her face, Amelia struggled to catch her breath as she related what had happened to Sarah and what she had witnessed herself. The gym teacher listened intently, her expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. When Amelia finished, she sighed heavily and reached for the phone. "I'm going to call the principal right now," she said grimly. "And we're going to get to the bottom of this." As they waited for the principal, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that they were all in grave danger. Whatever was in the school seemed to be drawing closer, its malevolent presence growing stronger by the second. She glanced nervously at the door, wondering if it would be able to hold back whatever horror lay waiting on the other side. Finally, the principal arrived, his face a mask of concern and confusion. Amelia and the gym teacher related their story once more, this time to the school's highest authority. The principal listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This is most disturbing," he murmured. "I will call the police immediately. In the meantime, all of you must remain in the staff room until further notice." As the principal hurried out to make the necessary calls, Amelia and the others huddled together in the stuffy staff room. The tension was palpable, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. "Do you think the police will be able to help?" whispered one of the teachers nervously. "Or is it already too late?" Amelia wished she had an answer, but she knew only one thing for certain. They couldn't give up hope. And so, as they waited for the police to arrive, they clung to each other for comfort and strength, their minds filled with terrifying visions of what might lie in store for them all. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as they waited, each tick of the clock bringing them closer to whatever fate awaited them. Finally, a commotion erupted outside the staff room door, and several officers burst in, their weapons drawn. The principal hurriedly introduced Amelia and the other teachers, explaining what they had witnessed. The police officers listened intently, their faces grim, before ordering everyone to evacuate the school. As they filed out onto the lawn, Amelia glanced back at the building one last time. The windows seemed to glow with an eerie light, as if whatever had been lurking inside was now watching them from the shadows. She shivered, suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of foreboding. But despite her fear, she refused to give in. She would find a way to stop whatever it was that had taken over her school. She had to. The officers set up a perimeter around the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched for any sign of the creature that had terrorized the students and staff. Amelia and the others huddled together under a tree, watching as the police worked, their minds racing with questions and theories. As the night wore on, the police found no sign of whatever it was that had been stalking them. The officers finally called off the search, and the school was closed indefinitely. Amelia and the other teachers were taken to a nearby hotel to stay for the night, while the police continued their investigation. Sleep refused to come to Amelia, her mind filled with the horrors of the day. She tossed and turned, her thoughts spiraling out of control. Finally, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. She crept out of bed and went to the window, gazing out at the darkened school grounds below. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the lawn, and she could almost imagine she saw movement in the distance. With a sigh, she sat down on the bed and reached for her phone. She had to do something, anything, to stop whatever it was that had invaded their lives. She needed help. She needed answers. And she knew exactly where to find them. The hallway stretched out before her, an endless maze of shadows and whispers. Amelia's heart thundered in her chest as she raced toward the source of the scream. Each step she took seemed to draw her deeper into the darkness, as if the very air around her had turned oppressive. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that the strange occurrences at Westbrook High were all just a figment of her overactive imagination. But as she turned a corner, she knew that she was far from safe. The dim light from a flickering fluorescent bulb cast eerie shadows across the walls, making the dust particles dance like ghostly apparitions. The smell of musty books and wet concrete filled her nostrils, mingling with the faint odor of something burning. She paused for a moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps, as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. But it was no use. The sense of foreboding that had been building inside her since she'd first felt the strange tug on her heart only grew stronger with each passing second. Around the next corner, she came face to face with a terrified classmate cowering against the wall. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, her lips moving soundlessly as she tried to form words that would not come. Amelia's heart ached for her, wanting nothing more than to comfort her and reassure her that everything was going to be okay. But as she reached out to touch the girl's trembling shoulder, a voice from the darkness spoke, its words like razor-sharp blades slicing through the silence. "Come to me, Amelia. You belong with us." She whirled around, her heart hammering in her chest, as she tried to make out the figure that stood in the shadows. It was Caleb, a boy she'd barely noticed before today. Now, he seemed to emanate an aura of darkness and power that was both frightening and intoxicating. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, boring into her very soul, as if he could see every secret she'd ever kept hidden away. And as she stared at him, unable to tear her eyes away, she felt a strange pull toward him, as if some invisible thread were tugging at her heartstrings. "What do you want from me?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the thunderous beating of her heart. Caleb took a step closer, his lips curling into a sinister smile. "You are the key, Amelia. You hold the power to set us free." The words sent a shiver of fear down her spine, but at the same time, they filled her with a sense of purpose, of destiny. She felt as if she were standing on the precipice of something momentous, something that would change the course of her life forever. And as Caleb continued to speak, his voice growing stronger and more commanding, she found herself unable to resist the pull he had on her. She took a step closer, drawn irresistibly toward the source of the darkness, toward the boy who held the key to whatever fate awaited her. The air around them seemed to crackle with energy, and the shadows lengthened, growing more substantial with each passing moment. Amelia could feel the weight of the responsibility that rested on her shoulders, the knowledge that the fate of not just herself, but of everyone around her, now lay in her hands. She took another step forward, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she prepared herself for whatever lay ahead. As she stood there, poised on the brink of destiny, she could feel the power coursing through her veins, the knowledge that she was no ordinary girl, but rather the chosen one, the key to unlocking the secrets of Westbrook High and setting things right. She could feel the darkness pressing in on her from all sides, trying to consume her, but she refused to let it win. For she knew that deep down inside, there was still a spark of light, a flicker of hope, that refused to be extinguished. And as she stood there, facing down the darkness, facing down Caleb, she made a decision. A decision that would change everything. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the coldness of his flesh against her own. Together, she whispered, her voice steady and strong, "We can stop this." The darkness seemed to recoil from her touch, and the shadows that had once surrounded them began to dissipate, fading back into the shadows from which they'd come. For a brief moment, she could see Caleb's features twist into a look of confusion and betrayal, as if he'd expected her to accept his offer and become a part of the darkness instead. But it was too late. Already, the balance was shifting, and she could feel the tide turning in their favor. As the last of the shadows vanished, the hallway seemed to brighten, and Amelia found herself able to breathe more easily. She looked at Caleb, feeling a mix of pity and determination welling up inside her. "You don't have to be a part of this," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "There's still time to change your path." For a moment, Caleb looked conflicted. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but in the end, no words came out. Instead, he turned away, his shoulders slumping, and walked slowly down the hall, disappearing around a corner. Amelia watched him go, her heart heavy with sadness and the weight of the knowledge that there was still much work to be done. But she also felt a sense of pride and purpose, a determination to see this through and put an end to the darkness that had been plaguing Westbrook High. Because deep down, she knew that she was more than just a girl with a strange gift. She was a hero, and it was her destiny to save them all. The hallway stretched out before Amelia, the dimly lit corridor casting an eerie glow over the cracked linoleum. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, a silence that seemed to vibrate with unspoken fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that the very fabric of the world was unraveling before her eyes. Her heart raced as she hurried towards the gym teacher's office, her shoes squeaking against the floor, in rhythm with her mounting dread. As she rounded a corner, a cold draft swept past her, sending shivers down her spine. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she swore she could feel eyes watching her from the shadows. Suddenly, a distant scream rent the air, piercing the silence and sending a chill to the very marrow of her bones. Her heart leapt into her throat as she quickened her pace, desperate to reach safety. The gym teacher's office loomed ahead, its door ajar, revealing a flickering light within. Amelia pushed it open and stepped inside, relief washing over her as she found the gym teacher, Mr. Jenkins, sitting at his desk, his attention fixed on the television. "Ah, Amelia," he said, looking up with a tired smile. "I was just about to call you in." She tried to return his smile, but found herself unable to mask the fear that clouded her features. "There's been some strange things happening at school lately," she said, taking a seat across from him. "I thought you should know." Mr. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've noticed it too," he replied, his voice low. "Things have been off, but I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." He paused, then added, "But I'm glad you came forward. It's always best to be cautious." As they spoke, the sounds of chaos erupted from the hallway, the screams and shouts growing louder and more frantic. Amelia and Mr. Jenkins exchanged worried glances before hurrying out of the office. They rounded a corner and found a group of students huddled together, terrified expressions etched onto their faces. "What's going on?" Amelia cried, her heart racing. "What happened?" No one answered, their silence only serving to heighten the sense of unease that permeated the air. Suddenly, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "Come to me, Amelia. You belong with us." The voice was cold and cruel, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She whirled around, searching for the source, but saw nothing but shadows and darkness. "Who said that?" she demanded, her voice quavering. There was no reply, only the distant sound of laughter, twisted and sinister. Her heart hammering in her chest, Amelia turned to Mr. Jenkins. "I think we should go to the principal's office," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Together, they hurried down the hall, their footsteps echoing on the linoleum like a death knell. As they approached the principal's office, they could see the door was open, light spilling out into the corridor. Cautiously, they peeked inside. The principal, Mrs. Wilson, was sitting at her desk, her expression one of shock and horror. Her eyes were fixed on something behind them, and as they turned to follow her gaze, they saw Caleb, the boy who had spoken to her earlier, standing in the doorway. He was flanked by a group of students, their faces twisted into ghastly masks. "You should have listened," he hissed. "Now you'll have to face the consequences." Fear gripped Amelia's heart as she realized the depth of Caleb's madness. She turned to Mr. Jenkins, but he was already moving, pushing her behind him protectively. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "We don't want any trouble." Caleb's eyes gleamed in the dim light, and he took a step forward, the movement fluid and menacing. "You don't understand," he hissed. "You're all in too deep now. With those words, he raised his hand, and the world went black. When Amelia awoke, she found herself lying on the cold linoleum floor, a sharp pain pulsing in the back of her head. She struggled to sit up, her vision blurry and her limbs weak. As her senses returned, she became aware of the silence that had replaced the chaos of before. The school was eerily still, as if the world had stopped spinning. With trembling legs, she stood up and ventured out of the principal's office. The hallways were deserted, the classrooms empty. A sense of dread filled her as she realized that something terrible had happened to everyone. She made her way to the gym, where she found Mr. Jenkins slumped over his desk, a single piece of paper lying next to him. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and unfolded it. Written in crude, block letters were the words, "You are all mine now." Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the horrific truth. Whatever had happened to the school had claimed all of them. As she stood there, the weight of her loss pressing down upon her, a distant voice echoed through the empty hallways. It was the voice of Caleb, whispering softly, "Come to me, Amelia. You belong with us." With a shudder, she turned and fled the gym, searching desperately for a way out, a way to escape the nightmare that had become her life. But she knew, deep down, that there was no escape. They were all trapped here, in this twisted version of reality, doomed to follow the whims of whatever dark force had claimed them. And as she ran through the halls, pursued by the whispers of the dead, she realized that she would never be free again. Amelia hesitated, her heart racing. She wanted nothing more than to run away and find help, but something held her back. She felt drawn to Caleb, as if she were under some sort of spell. As they walked deeper into the school, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being led into a trap. The zombies followed close behind, their blank eyes seeming to stare through her. Caleb smiled reassuringly, his voice soft and seductive. "Don't be afraid, Amelia. I am here to protect you." She glanced over her shoulder at the undead figures shuffling behind them, their limbs moving stiffly, their skin a deathly pale. The darkness seemed to cling to them like a second skin. Shuddering, she turned back to Caleb. His eyes glowed in the near-total darkness, his features sharp and angular in the dim light. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and he wore a black leather jacket that seemed to mirror the evil that emanated from him. They continued to walk deeper into the school, past classrooms with their doors hanging off their hinges and blackboards covered in graffiti. Amelia couldn't help but wonder what horrific things had transpired here. She tried to remember if anything unusual had happened recently, anything that could have led to this nightmare, but her mind drew a blank. As they rounded a corner, they came to a stop in front of a massive, ornate wooden door. Caleb placed a hand on the handle and smiled at her. "Are you ready to see the truth, Amelia?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "To know what you truly are." Her heart pounded in her chest, but she nodded anyway, unable to find her voice. Caleb opened the door, revealing a grand hall beyond, lit by flickering candles. At the far end, a massive throne sat upon a dais, its carved arms twisted into cruel-looking shapes. The throne was empty, but Amelia could feel its presence like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Caleb gestured for her to follow him, and they began to walk up the aisle. The zombies trailed behind them, their footsteps sounding hollow on the polished marble floor. As they drew closer to the throne, Amelia could see that it was made of a black stone she'd never seen before. Its surface was etched with symbols she didn't recognize, and it seemed to glow faintly with an otherworldly light. When they reached the dais, Caleb turned to face her, his expression solemn. "You are the key, Amelia," he said, his voice taking on a commanding quality. "It is your destiny to sit upon this throne and rule over us all." Amelia shook her head in denial, her heart racing. "No, I don't want this," she stammered. "I don't want any of this." Caleb's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she thought he might strike her down where she stood. But then, his expression softened, and he took a step closer. "You don't understand," he whispered. "You were chosen for this. You have the power to set us free from the darkness that has consumed us." She searched his face, trying to find any sign of the boy she'd once known. But all she saw was a dark, twisted version of him, one who was capable of doing unspeakable things. And despite her fear, a part of her found that thrilling powerful. She could feel it coursing through her veins, and for a moment, she imagined what it would be like to wield that power. Caleb reached out and took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Come with me, Amelia," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Let us show you the way forward." She hesitated for a moment longer, her heart racing, but in the end, she found herself unable to resist the pull of his gaze. Slowly, she allowed herself to be led up onto the dais, the weight of his hand in hers a strange comfort in the midst of this madness. As they stood before the throne, she knew that there was no going back, no escape from the darkness that awaited her. But as she looked into Caleb's eyes, she saw something else as well. A spark of hope, a glimmer of light in the endless darkness. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe he wasn't lying to her. Maybe there was a way to use this power for good. As they stood there, the zombies crowding around them like a sea of shadows, Amelia couldn't help but feel a strange sense of destiny. As if everything that had happened until now had been leading up to this moment. And whether she was ready or not, she knew that she would have to face whatever came next. She steeled herself, taking a deep breath, and looked up at Caleb. "Show me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Show me what I need to do." A slow, wicked smile spread across his face. "Of course, my queen," he replied, his voice echoing through the throne room. "As you wish." And with that, he placed a hand on the black stone throne, and the world vanished. The darkness receded, replaced by a brilliant white light. Amelia blinked several times, her eyes adjusting to the sudden glare. When her vision finally cleared, she found herself standing in a lush, vibrant garden. The sun shone down from a cloudless sky, bathing the flowers in a warm, golden light. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and the scent of roses filled the air. She turned to Caleb, who stood beside her, his expression somewhat bemused. "Welcome to your new kingdom, my queen," he said, gesturing around them. "This is your power, your responsibility. It is up to you to use it wisely, and to bring balance to the world once more." Amelia felt a tear trickle down her cheek. "But how?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can I possibly do that?" Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. "You'll find your own way, Amelia," he said, his voice gentle. "You always have. You just have to trust yourself. Trust your heart." She looked up at him, hope beginning to flicker inside her. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her voice shaking. "Thank you for showing me this. For giving me a chance." He smiled back at her, his eyes filled with a warmth she hadn't seen in so long. "You're welcome, Amelia," he said. "You have no idea how much this means to me." They stood there in silence for a moment, the sounds of the garden surrounding them. And then, with a deep breath, Amelia turned back to the garden, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she did so, she felt Caleb's presence beside her, his support unwavering. Together, they walked forward into the bright, beautiful future they had created. A future where darkness would never again reign supreme.